So welcome, Christine. And I think you have a sense of what these salons are like. And we're going to start just by a round of introductions. So you have a sense of who's here. And what I've asked people to do is maybe to introduce themselves, maybe tell us where you're actually physically located. And if you've read the book, what part you want to make sure to dig into today, and that I don't, forget to cover. And I'll make sure to take copious notes. My former academic self cannot. And otherwise, if you haven't read the book, what is it that interests you in this salon? Why did you feel it would just be the perfect thing to do this afternoon, morning, evening, whatever? Okay. Shall we start with? How about we go around with Elena? Elena. Yeah. That way.
Hi. Yeah, this is kind of a surprise. I didn't know I was going until this morning. I'm actually here as research to host my own salon. I've never been to one of these, but I picked this topic specifically because it's very confusing for me and also something I want to relate to better. And I've been really figuring out my sexuality, for lack of a better word or phrase, all over Twitter. And this seems like a great place to go and like first salon to check out about that. So I have no context with this book, but really I've had a lot of insight and progress from talking to people online about this. So may as well do that here.
Beautiful. Thank you for joining us. Kevin. Thank you for joining us. And I was saying that I'm really pleased that there are a few men that have shown up, because I think there's some really interesting insights we might or might not garner from them. So let's hear from you, Kevin.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Kevin. I'm I live in Zurich, Switzerland. And I didn't know I was going to this salon until about an hour ago when I was reading about ISO certification, and Anna messaged me, and here I am.
Awesome. Well, welcome. Joël. Is that how to say your name?
Actually, it's Julie.
Oh.
My mother just spelled it weird.
Sorry.
Nope, you're good. I'm in Salt Lake City, Utah. I have not read your book. However, I have read The Right to Sex, and I've read Tomorrow's Sex Will Be Good, and several others, like Sex at Dawn, and various other books. I have a couple of friends who finished PhDs in human sexuality, and we kind of all did book group together for years. So
yeah,
that sounds fun.
It was a lot of fun, especially when you throw wine and chocolate and cheese into it.
Nice.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I too have a couple of, two of my closest friends for 20 years are sexuality researchers. Meredith Shivers is one of them. You might know her, Christine, but she does work in human or female sexuality in particular. And so when we were doing our PhDs together, I would be like getting stimuli from my own experiments, which are like aggressive kids in bullying contexts. And I was like, okay, I have to watch these videos. And she would be watching like, female-oriented pornography and getting all these stimuli for like all sorts of other types of things. And I was like,
for science.
Wow, we have a different scientific angle to our work. So yeah. Tina.
Great to meet everyone. I'm Tina. I'm actually joining from Canada today. Background in actually data science, machine learning, engineering, so a bit different, but I have very strong interest in psychology in general. And yeah, what I'm looking forward to is kind of like, seeing this perspective on, how does your thinking about sex changes like as you, grow mature, older. So this is kind of like what I'm looking forward to learning about more.
Great. Thank you very much. Shahid.
Hey, I'm Shahid. Happy to be here. This is my third or fourth salon at this point, and it kind of feels about time to get a membership. So maybe I should. I live in Austin, Texas. I grew up in a kind of medium conservative family in Singapore, and I think I kind of just lived through different sort of like social norm systems regarding sexuality and dating and all these things. I don't have a particular academic interest in the topic. It's just a personal interest as a single man in my 20s. And, I think it's a fascinating topic. I'm kind of glad that what seems like a slightly underrated perspective is sort of being brought up here. And I'm just want to have a fun conversation.
Awesome. Thank you for coming.
Yeah. Right.
Pamela.
Hi. Excuse me. I'm Pamela Hobart. I'm also in Austin, Texas. I am wrapping up my work week before I go pick up my kids. So apologies in advance for ducking out, but that's actually part of my interest is like, although things are okay for me and I sort of made it out of the dating in New York City as a 20-something woman unscathed, I'm interested in what's ahead for them sexually, because these things change. And I sort of feel like everyone is so black and white about it, either like every sexual encounter that you don't have that's not rape is unequivocally good, or everyone that you have is like bad and you're ruined. And like, no, but who's kind of representing the subtlety in here. And so I was very pleased to see that Christine, you've written a book exactly in that space. So I have not read it in its entirety, but I look forward to hearing more.
Oh, you're gonna love it. It's exactly dealing with what you're just interested in. So this is great for you. Anna, maybe you can go and then I'll go back down.
Hi, I'm Anna. I'm the founder of Interact. We talk so much, Christine, about relationships and our psychological build-up and sense of the world at Interact at our salons. And one of the things that kind of like comes up a lot is, how people feel that how we talk about relationships and sexuality doesn't actually match their lived experience. They're like, there are things I actually enjoy, like Pamela, you said, like there are things that I enjoy that's supposed to be like terrible for me. And there are things that, I'm sold by mainstream culture as amazing and everybody doing it. And you're like, actually, nobody I know is doing this and nobody likes it. And sometimes we just sit down and we're like, are we crazy? Are so many people crazy? Or is there some kind of major discrepancy within the narrative? And I'm always amazed to find out more about what people actually want and what they actually feel and think. The part that really deeply resonated with me in your book was the Aristotelian ethics angle. And I think it's, spoiler alert, I think the fact that we kind of arrive to that point through your story, to me was a revelation. And I'm so happy that you wrote this. I also see, amongst my friends and in the community and in my own life as well, that any encounter that lacks an element of human decency and dignity or willing the good, as you put it, is in some way lacking. And unless you actually want something that is devoid of dignity and you consciously go for that, which may be a completely valid experiment in somebody's life, you will probably feel like, that should have been nicer, or he or she should have been kinder. And so I'm deeply, deeply interested in opening new arenas of ethics in how we talk about sexuality, whether that's within a marriage or, I don't know, hookup, a one-time thing. The ethics part to me is the same across all of it, because we are the same humans with unalienable dignity in us in all of the situations. So to me, that's something where I'm like, we need to talk more about this. And I hope we will during this salon.
Absolutely. Thank you, Anna. James.
Hello, I'm James. I'm a somatic breakthrough facilitator and emotional healing coach. And this topic actually comes up a lot with my clients of how fulfilled they are in their relationship. So I'm here partially because of that, partially because I want to host my own salon and I'm exploring that. But also personally, I've been having sex for 2/3 of the
I invited him. We're going to be co-hosting.
Yes.
Oh, nice.
Yes. So I'm like kind of new to Twitter, and Elena is introducing me to this whole world that is there and available. So I'm super excited about that. But on the personal realm, I just I've been studying and involved in masculine feminine polarity for a long time. And now I'm in a relationship with someone who's submissive, and that's kind of new to me. And so I'm like back to this newness and freshness, and kind of figuring out how this aligns with everything else in my life. And so I'm curious to just see how all this shows up, and I'm glad to be here.
Great. Thank you. Welcome. Rick.
Hi, thanks, Isabella. I'm really glad to be here. This isn't my first salon. I went to so many during the initial lockdowns, and it was such an enhancement to my life, but I've been away for a while, so it's great to be back. I'm afraid I haven't had a chance to read the book yet, but I'm very thankful I've managed to win one, so I will be looking forward to doing that. And one of my interests in coming here is, so I was working as a relationship coach actually during lockdown, and speaking to a lot of people about their relationships, and that sort of really made me think there needs to be a lot of these conversations going on and a lot of serious thought put into it, which I think this is all about. And it strikes me that whenever we enter into a sexual or even just romantic relationship with somebody, we're putting a lot of our attachment trauma into their hands, and we're really exposing ourselves to be hurt in ways that we might not even realize are part of ourselves. We might not even realize we're exposing ourselves to. And how do you navigate that in a way? I think one of the real problems of this topic is that it's possible that two people who even are being very thoughtful and communicative with one another might end up hurting one another through not thinking, or through having different ideas about what love means, or there's so much there. And how do we as a society approach that? And certainly when I was at school, there was nothing like consent-based sex education. There was nothing about how to build a relationship with functional communication where two people could be happy. It was more about, this is how you put on a condom. So how do we, not only like how should we behave, but how should society approach this topic and try to like shift norms in a way that's going to work for everyone, so that because I guess ideally we find people who have just like amazing communication skills and social skills, and who are really loving and are able to negotiate this one-on-one. But is that a realistic expectation that everyone we're going to meet and connect with in society is going to have them? I don't know. So I'm really fascinated to see what everyone's thoughts are and explore this a bit deeper.
Great. Thank you very much. Brian.
Hey, everyone. I'm Brian. Live in Las Vegas, Nevada. Anna told me about this salon yesterday, actually. And it seemed like an interesting topic, because I feel like for the last few years, most of like sex discourse that I've encountered has been on Twitter, which is probably a less than ideal place for people to discuss.
Christine, this is for you to research what's going on Twitter in terms of sex.
It's just science. I don't know. Maybe it's just because of. I mean, I don't know how it happened, but it's just like, I don't know. It always seems like, you have like men with one perspective, you have women with another perspective, and then they all just kind of fight with each other, and there doesn't seem to be any shared common ground. At least with the it's probably with the most vocal ones. The people that tend to be the most malcontent, discontent are the ones that usually are more vocal. So maybe that's why. But yeah, no, I'm interested to see how this discussion will go here.
Thank you. I mean, one of the things that I am interested in is that I often wonder if the conversations that we had on these dating apps would be similar to the ones that we have in terms of experiences in the II. I think we would have a very different perspective in general around hookup culture, and maybe we could hook up if it's like, we're talking philosophy for 3 hours beforehand. I don't know. Mary.
Hey everyone, I'm Mary. I'm in California, from California. Yeah, I think as everybody, I don't have the book yet also, but it's on its way and I'm very excited. I think I was just listening as people were talking, and I ended up taking a bunch of notes already. But I think it's just so many, like, I'll just go down the list. So it's like, for me, I think it's something, originally I was interested in this because I feel like it's a topic with so many conflicting points of view, and so many people are very loud about it, but it's also deeply personal. So it's confusing, that disconnect sometimes of what's real and what's not real. Throw in there fair amounts of taboo and cultural norms. And then politics also always makes its way in there, right? And then, I don't know, sort of thinking about it in terms of like, what does it mean for me personally, to be a woman in the 21st century in the US, in one of the most liberal cities ever. What does that mean? Like, am I, like, I don't know, like, what are the implications for my life? And then just thinking more broadly about how much of this is like, for me, do I view it as subjective versus like objective? And like, sort of the ethics around that. But yeah, looking forward to this.
Great. Thank you very much. And so I will just quickly just reorient where I am coming from. So I'm Isabela Granic, and I'm the host today. Thank you very much, and all for being here. And just for Christine's sake, to repeat the fact that I am, well, let's take another angle. I'm a developmental psychologist and researcher in technology and mental health for young people. And I am also the mother of two 16-year-old boys who are perfection and great and wonderful. And I cannot even tell you how awesome they are, but they're 16-year-old boys. And I shouldn't have to say anything more than that, really. And I think they are the conversations we have at the dinner table. It's become abundantly clear in the last year that their entire education has been consent-based and fear-based. They're scared out of their living mind to go out and do anything. And it's questions like, do I need to ask permission to kiss a girl? And I'm like, I know what they would tell you. And I'm like, but I got to tell you, as a 16-year-old girl, that wouldn't have been a great thing if somebody asked me permission. But how do I talk to you about vibes? I don't know how to talk to you about vibes, right? But the main thing that, we've learned, at least together, is to talk. The talking is the fascinating thing. And the more we get more of their friends over talking slowly but surely, it's really an interesting space. So I'm deeply interested from the perspective of a mother of two 16-year-old boys. I'm also deeply interested as a, never mind the researcher part, and one of my closest friends is a sexuality researcher, but from a perspective of, I am a 52-year-old woman who is pretty much off any kind of discussions, out of any discussions around sexuality and around sexual activity and what the mores are and any of that, right? Never mind that I'm married, but there are just really interesting conversations around and so one of my main interests that I introduced at the beginning of this salon, Christine, when you weren't here, was that I'm very interested about the extent to which some of your really important insights are restricted to, or at least most relevant to, an age of around, like, millennials, like maybe around 25 to 38, 40 or something like that. I don't know. It's a question I have, because I think that there's some really interesting things that might be differently applied at different ages and phases of our life. So I'll leave that till a much later time. And I want to just dive into asking you, Christine, if you could introduce yourself to us and maybe tell us a little bit. I'm in Toronto, by the way. Tell us a little bit about where you are and also why you wrote the book, the feeling of like, why could you not do anything but writing the book, which is what we often find writers say about their books.
Yeah, that is what writers should feel, I think. But yes, hello. I'm Christine Emba. I'm based in Washington, D.C., and I'm an opinion columnist and sometime editor at the Washington Post. And my beat is ideas in society, which can be kind of anything, which is great some days when I have the freedom to really chase my interests, and then terrible the days when I have to pick a topic and write about it and settle down in one lane. But Rethinking Sex is my first book. It came out late last month. And yes, it basically is about, this broad question. How do we think about sex right now? Are we thinking about it in ways that are faulty or incorrect? What's going on in sort of a sexual culture that is ostensibly, the freest and most liberated it's ever been, but in which many people still seem to feel kind of miserable and lost? And in not all cases, but certainly in some. And it stands in contrast to, I guess, what we're sort of told we should be feeling. How did I start writing this book? So, Beta's Ideas in Society, I'm very interested in questions of, gender, ethics, relationality, just how we relate to each other in society. And I was writing a number of columns about the Me Too movement in 2017 and 2018, just obviously a fascinating period. And in sort of watching the rollout of these Me Too cases and questions, both the clear cut and the not so clear cut, I came to a couple of realizations, or rather questions. So first of all, just the fact that we were still trying to figure out, and luckily came to a conclusion fairly quickly, but I guess actually only over the course of decades, really, that, Harvey Weinstein, you can't lock your underlings into hotel rooms and assault them. Like, that's not okay. Stop doing that. The fact that we still had to have this discussion now suggested that we perhaps had not come as far as we thought we had come. Mm-hmm. But even with those clear-cut cases, where we could say, okay, something is wrong in this situation, and it is that a sexual assault happened, consent has been breached. That was one thing, and those were many of the more high-profile cases. Then there was sort of a second tranche of stories and discussions going on. The shitty media men list in the US, the Aziz Ansari debacle as told to babe.net, the New Yorker short story Cat Person, which I think is still the most read piece of short fiction that the New Yorker has ever published, they say.
Can I pause you for a second? Sorry, can I pause you for a second? Is there any way that you can get, because I think the cat person thing is going to keep coming up. Is there a way for you to just give us like a 1-minute summary for those of us who didn't know about it?
Right, of course. So Cat Person was the short story basically about a college-age woman who goes on a date with an older guy, and they sleep together, and it kind of sucks. She sleeps with him even though she doesn't really want to. She sort of feels that she should because she's there. And then afterwards, the relationship devolves kind of crudely. But that's the whole story. And it's told in a close third person. And then Aziz Ansari, this comedian who actually had recently come out with his sort of feminist guide to romance, went on a date with this young woman who recounted it anonymously to this women's website, saying that it was the worst night of her life. She alleged that Ansari sort of pressured her into having sex, or tried to pressure her into having sex. She sort of pushed back, but she felt uncomfortable. Eventually, she left in tears. And, cases like these stories were, first of all, they resonated with so many people. I mean, again, there's the popularity of Cat Person and so many women coming forward and saying, oh, yeah, that's happened to me. This is the normal thing that happens in our lives. The Ansari story, so many women and men saying, yeah, okay, that has happened to me too. And then there was back and forth of, well, he didn't assault her. She did consent to some things, then she stopped consenting and went home, and she felt bad about it. But what are we supposed to do with that? Those cases to me suggested that consent might not be enough to give us good sex. Consent was ostensibly obtained in many of these encounters, and yet people left them feeling sort of sad, depressed, even traumatized. Yes, John Gameshi. And the fact that so many people related so closely to those stories suggested that this was, normal. And if this sort of encounter is normal in our sexual culture, it seems like something might be deeply off. And I found this fascinating. Also, just talking with friends, with colleagues, with people on the street about these stories as I was writing these and reporting and researching these. And I guess I wanted to investigate the roots of this kind of sexual malaise in some ways, this way that the culture did not seem to be serving people what they thought they might. And so in the book, I have a couple of threads. One is the question of consent. While consent is a necessary baseline, it's something that we have to have. It's a non-negotiable. And it took us a while even to get to the place where we could say that. It seems that it is a floor. It's not a ceiling. It was never meant to be the ceiling. And consent talks about kind of legal criterion for how do you have sex that's not assault? How can you have sex that's not outrageously criminal? But I think most people want sex that's more than not actually rape. They want sex that's good. And so I wonder why we are not talking less about what's legal and more about what's good, meaning moral and ethical and actually good for the parties involved. And what does that look like? What does that mean? And why is perhaps consent not enough? And then the second question is kind of the faulty assumptions, perhaps, that push people into or make people feel as though they're pressured to go along with a sexual culture that isn't serving them. So what are the assumptions that we've made about how we should be having sex or what sex means or what it doesn't mean, that are maybe getting us into these situations or normalizing things that shouldn't be normalized? So in the book, I ask questions about, what we mean when we talk about freedom, what we mean when we talk about sex, what sex means to us. Is it just another activity or is it meaningful in a special way? And then, of course, questions about what dating apps are doing to our sexual culture. But yeah, just getting to the bottom of, I think, what's going on and why so many people seem to feel so uncomfortable in this culture and yet don't feel like they can talk about it.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really lovely kind of overview of the sort of some of the main themes also that you covered. And I think that one of the things that I really appreciated about your writing is throughout it, you're not, as much as it's so hard, you're not giving prescriptions, and it's very hard. On one hand, it's like easy not to get to, and it's easy to fall into you do you kind of thing, as you even say in the book specifically. And so there was this kind of, I think, brave dual or non-duality around the ways that you approach the questions, where it's like, don't quite have the answers, but there's lots of questions we're not asking, and let's try to keep asking those really important questions, which I really appreciated. I'm also wondering whether you felt yourself that you got to anything new, or maybe, for lack of a better word, a satisfying place in the process of you writing and researching the book. Like, is there something, are there answers even in the semi-non-answers that have that A, were novel and you found through the process of writing, and B, whether they feel satisfying right now to you, or whether you feel like there's still so much more?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's always so much more. This is a classic sort of first author book, where I was like, oh, I'll just write about sex. That's going to be my topic, which this could have been 7 different books. And so there's so much that just had to be left out for it to actually be a coherent story in some ways. I like what you said about the book being not being prescriptive. Rethinking Sex is subtitled a provocation, not a prescription, in part because, one of the things that I was trying to do with the book is to provoke conversation about where to go next. Mm-hmm. After, as the Me Too moment was happening, as all these stories were coming out, there seemed to be a consensus that we were arriving at that, like, oh, something is off here. Something's off in our sexual culture. And it's great to be able to recognize that something is off, but how long are you just going to spend sitting around being like, wow, it's bad. This is bad. To actually move forward, you have to begin to make sort of substantive claims and arguments about where to go, what better would look like, what good looks like. And I was kind of trying to put some of these forward in the book to be argued about and further refined by other people, knowing that I may not have the correct answer. I may have my insights and my perspective, but that putting them forward and actually opening that conversation so that people felt that they could have it aloud was an important step. Places where I did feel like I arrived at some stronger conclusions in the book. So I will also say that the process of the book too was an interesting one in that, it started almost as an academic project, writing about Me Too, thinking about what's going on in our sexual culture. And I ended up just talking to so many people, just dozens of interviews with men and women in between about, what they thought sex means, what they were experiencing, what they wanted from it. And there were a number of threads that came up very frequently that I was kind of surprised by because they didn't necessarily seem reflected in what was going on in the culture. So one prescription I would say that I did have in the book was this idea of willing the good of the other as a higher standard and a better standard than consent. Again, to be clear, consent is the baseline, you need it. But if you want to have actually sort of good sex, what does that look like? And willing the good of the other is a formulation from Aristotle via Thomas Aquinas. And it was actually his definition of love. And not just romantic love, but love in sort of a deep sense. And it would mean, caring about the other person's good, caring about, their participation in the encounter as much as you care about your own, which means not seeing them as a means to an end, seeing them as a person in their full human dignity. And it also implicates you in seeking out the good, trying to figure out what sex means so that you can figure out what good sex is. And it's a higher standard than just consent. But I suggest that moving towards that, even if we necessarily will fail at it or be confused at it or confused by it at some points, is still several steps further than where we are today. So that was one takeaway that I think is pretty sturdy and was reflected in a lot of the conversations that I had with people. Because so many people, when I asked them for, okay, what do you want from sex, actually? Like, what do you think a good sexual encounter looks like? Inevitably, they would say things like, well, being listened to, or empathy, or care. As one woman said, can we not just love each other for a single day, even if that day is just the 1 hour that we spend together? And I thought that was actually a pretty substantial takeaway when thinking about what a better culture would look like.
Yeah. I think the reason I realized I was on mute, this is where I wrote the most, is that area around the willing the good of the other. And because, to some extent, your discussion around rethinking sex to me is really much broader and has to do with rethinking relationships to one another and responsibilities to one another. And it starts maybe at that sort of, I don't even believe in individuals. That's like already the basic unit for me is at least the dyad, if not more so, and then outwards towards that. And so I wondered also whether upon feeling like you'd finished this book, whether it felt much bigger to you as it did to at least one reader, than the issue of sex, because this is about having good conversations. It's about how to care for others in more general ways. And I think it comes to caring for your kids or the elder. Like, there's something about it that's much more basic than how to have good sex, although there's, of course, a lot of applicability to that. But I wonder if you resonate, and that'll be my last question, and then I'll open it up to everyone else.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's right. And that's actually something that readers picked up on, I think, before I did. So a good friend of mine who I did a podcast with about the book mentioned, he said to me that this is a book, Rethinking Sex is ostensibly a book about sex, but it's also a larger meditation on, the questions of what freedom means and what freedom really looks like. And, questions of sort of the liberal autonomous self and a critique of that idea that we're all sort of individuals pursuing our desires that can't be questioned, and we have no responsibility to other people. And I think throughout the book, I kept coming back to exactly what you were talking about, this idea that, we're not just individuals existing in the void whose desires, spout just from themselves. We are contingent particulars in some ways. We are influenced by other people. Our actions have influences on others. And to live in a society, we do have duties and responsibilities to each other, to care. And I think sex being a really intimate activity, especially one that is actually serious and can have real consequences up to and including creating another person, can be sort of a locus for how we ask these questions about how we relate to each other and what a good relationship means on a broader scale.
Great, thank you. So I could go on and on, but this is not just about you and me chatting. I would love to hear from other people, whether you've read the book or not. I just encourage you. It's not something like, oops, you didn't get to the end or anything like that. This is really about diving into all of our curiosities around what's working, what's not, how to think through these questions.
I might jump in and ask about the human freedom element, because it's so interesting. I remember reading Mating in Captivity a couple of years ago by Esther Perel. And, I read the book and I felt toward the end a little bit like how you guys felt about Rethinking Sex, that, oh my God, this is about something so much more. But in my understanding, she may actually have arrived at a completely different conclusion than you have, Christine. Because my strong feeling after Mating in Captivity was that it's about the human freedom from a very individualistic point of view, right? Because she doesn't talk about the singles culture, she talks about marriage. And I felt that toward the end, she kind of arrived at this conclusion that there is some kind of untouchable freedom contained in every individual, that we'll always dream and always fantasize, and inside you're always free. And even if you've been married to somebody for many, many decades, you never really get to that, like we can't really control or own each other, right? And that was kind of a shocking conclusion to me. And I spent a lot of time thinking about it. So I would be excited to think through the other angle of this, which is questioning the, or like defining more clearly the limits of that individual freedom. Like how far can you go with that? Okay, like we have that untouchable core, but we still relate to each other. How do you align that? I mean, we all know, like if you have a big group of friends, you have these walking mysteries. Like you've been friends for 30 years and still your friend will surprise you. And you will be like, oh my God, like how come I didn't know this about you for 30 years? So to me, that will never cease to be interesting. Was this a conscious decision on your end to dive more deeply into the freedom element?
Yeah, that's a really interesting contrast. And I think that both of these understandings can live in tandem. So one of the things that I thought was really important to state out front as one of my priors is this idea of human dignity and sort of inviolability, right? That we are actually each humans and valuable as humans and shouldn't be used in the service of others. We shouldn't be objectified and we shouldn't treat each other as commodities or tools because of kind of exactly what you're saying, that we are each our own person. That said, I think what I'm critiquing in the book and what I sort of try and think around is what almost feels like the current sex positivity mantra that's almost based on a consent assumption, that sex is almost something that we are getting from another person, not something that's done in relationship. And so in some ways, consent is used as a like, well, as long as I get consent, I've made an agreement with this other person that we're both going to exchange this thing, and we no longer have any responsibility to each other outside of what we've agreed to. So I don't have to think about the other person as long as they've consented to this. And I found that just focusing, one of my critiques on, sort of seeing consent as the highest ideal, or rather consent as the only way in which we talk about whether sex is good or not, is that it really seems to reify this idea, right? That again, that it's an exchange, it's about the legal argument, and that there's no further responsibility to the person as person apart from this thing that you've agreed to, which just leaves so much out, right? How was consent gotten? Was that consent fairly gotten? Is it good for us as individuals to even be doing what we've gotten consent, to do? What can we expect from sex, and what should we expect from sex socially? What kind of world for ourselves and others do our consensual affairs create? And I think that doesn't negate that every person is an individual, but it, I think, suggests that we need to also think of each other and think of ourselves in relationship or in relation to one another, not just pursuing our own desires under sort of a fig leaf of a legal fiction that allows us to do so. Does that make sense?
Yes, and you had a pun with fig leaf.
It's also very much about consumerism. No, it's almost like a business
Totally.
transaction. Like, I paid, I get what I asked for. If not, I go to customer service. I remember a couple of years ago, the infamous Jordan Peterson had this video on the internet about how sex was serious. And I was just laughing because, oh my God, for my generation, that's like the most scandalous statement. Like, if you say sex is serious, you're basically a punk. And I don't know, you will, I don't know what will happen to you. And he was like, yeah, it's serious because like you can get hurt emotionally, you can contract an STD, you can get pregnant. And people were like, wow, like literally nobody in our generation ever said these words out loud. And it was just an interesting kind of flip that we live in this upside down world these days. Maybe consumerism is to blame for it. Although without consumerism, we wouldn't have this many beautiful books. So.
Well, that was like one of the things, I mean, there's literally a chapter in this book too that, sex is spiritual, actually, more than just serious. But one of the things that, when I asked people about sort of what sex meant to them, so many of them were like, I feel like I'm supposed to view sex as just like a fun activity that we do that like doesn't have any meaning to it. But actually, it means something to me. It means something serious for a variety of reasons. A woman, I tell the story in this book of a woman who is telling me about her sexual assault. And she says, I would have almost rather that he just like punched me in the face and stole my phone or something. But he didn't do that. He sexually assaulted me. And that felt different and worse because sex is a very specific kind of spiritual way that we relate to other people. And this was an intuition that so many of the people I interviewed had, but exactly this felt like they couldn't say that because they were repressed or they would be seen as old-fashioned or religious in some way. And so even though they felt this way about sex, cultural pressures sort of pushed them to act differently, out of accordance with what they felt. So also one of the projects of the book, right, was to kind of figure out where these pressures were coming from, what false assumptions were people being asked to hold about sex that weren't aligning with the truth and aligning with, bringing them towards the relationship that they really desired.
I want to follow up with this because I'm confused around that element that even though I understand what you're saying, first of all, I'm deeply confused by the fact that this is a shock or that anyone would find this novel, that the idea of sexual assault or not even assault, but having sex when you don't want it, that anyone would have to justify it by explaining in such levels of, that you'd have to invoke spirituality and invoke these large, meaningful contexts or understandings or philosophy is shocking to me because it's like sort of, I didn't realize we'd have to go into that kind of rationalization. And partially the real reason why I'm surprised by that is you have, in some ways, huge progress made in terms of taking women seriously for even the what would have been considered, sorry, my cat is a psycho, what would be considered even a minor infraction 30 years ago of, like, you know, hitting someone's ass at work, or you know, catcalling or something like that. You can get in serious freaking legal trouble now around this. So I'm confused how, on the one hand, we as a society seem to have very much acknowledged that this shit is real. But you're saying that in the conversations you're having, people have to have a real discussion around why that is. Can you help me and that cat? I'm going to go kill right now.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really, I think that dichotomy is real and strange, and it's something that, you know, hasn't even fully been worked through. I think one of the things that I noticed, again, in how we talked about what was wrong with these things, what was wrong in these Me Too cases, again, often centered on sort of like the legal allowed versus not allowed thing. You know, like, you shouldn't slap someone on the ass because they didn't consent to you slapping them on the ass. Like, I don't know, you shouldn't like have sex with your subordinate who, if they don't consent to having sex with you. But like, that was the only criterion. There was not very much conversation about, okay, but why? Like, what is it specifically about a sexual act or like this kind of encounter that makes it fraught? You know, the only question being asked is, well, did you get permission? If so, then you could do what you want, and if not, you shouldn't. And I think actually sort of relegating these questions of like, you know, what sex means, what these encounters signify, why they're important or not, is something that's kind of been pushed off stage by a consent-based culture. And that's actually a problem, because then it becomes hard to sort of justify, you know, why one might feel certain ways.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think that the reason why I'm also, you know, very confused by this whole thing is because, you know, 25 years ago, my master's and soon to be PhD supervisor, I slept with him. He is now my husband for the last 25 years, and we have 2 kids, and we're still together. But at that time, the conversation was entirely about power. And even though I had consented, there was extreme annoying discussion around my ability to consent. And there was, because of the power dynamics, anybody that knew either one of us knew very clearly where the power dynamics was. And I mean, I laugh about it only because you got to know the 2 people in question. But the point I feel is that even then, 25 years ago, there was serious discussion around what coercion is and what it wasn't, and how much a woman could even say for herself that she felt coerced or not. So I'm wondering if what you're talking about now is moving the conversation from power dynamics. This is only off the top of my head, so I might be completely wrong, and everybody jump on me, please, if this is wrong. From power dynamics to a discussion around a one more complex around intimacy, or what is spirituality, you also call it, and what is that thing that is ephemeral that we still never discussed, but we put it into power dynamics from that sort of second wave of feminism and so on. Does that feel somewhere close to seeming right?
I think so. I mean, I think part of my sort of problem here, what I am trying to provoke people to talk about, is these questions, like many of them, whether it's power dynamics and like what that actually means, coercion, what that actually looks like, intimacy, what that looks like. We sort of have some sense these things are happening, but don't really speak about them aloud in our conversations about sex and what sex should look like. So in many cases, they're all sort of in the background and clearly influencing, you know, how we have sex or how we think about it and how we interact with other people, but they aren't stated outright. You know, we don't make substantive cases for what any of these things mean. And that leads to people being really confused about like what the norms actually are, where the boundaries really lie, what they should and shouldn't be doing.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. So I'm going to pause because I do this as a prof. When I was doing a prof, I do not get uncomfortable with pauses, and I can completely outstare you because I think it's really, there's just too much compelling stuff, and I can keep jumping in and Anna can keep jumping in, but I really would love to hear from others. Questions or comments or experiences you want to share, or
Julie has her hand up. Guys, do you want to use the hand up feature? Do you know how to use it? It's if you click on reactions, there's raise hand.
Okay, there we go.
Lovely.
Hey, so back to Anna's, mating in captivity. I think that Esther really brought up a good point about how we have cultural norms that don't necessarily meet our biological wants and desires. And I think that was her biggest thing yes, we do have a culture and we do need to think of other people, but at the same time, is our culture necessarily going with our own biological hardwiring, And I mean, she talks about how, a lot of people, and again, it goes back to couples, how they cheat, because it's not necessarily that they cheat, it's just they've become bored and they've hit a midlife crisis of some sort. Somebody's died, they've had children grow up and move away, they've done all of that stuff. And I think that is something that we really don't talk about, is the forced norm around sexuality. And yes, consent is one of those forced norms now, but we've had forced norms since biblical times. And, has it ever really worked?
Good question. So in the book, this is part of the notes that I was talking about. I think this is really, you speak to it, Christine. Is it Christine or Christina?
Christine, no A.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I knew it was no A, but I thought you had pronounced the E at that end. Okay. So anyway, I think very much taking Julie's point is that you set out this argument that women and men are different, and we need to just accept that. And that it speaks to Julie's biological differences that we need to sort of accept and recognize and talk about. And then you give examples that are like ranging from things like we're responsible for birth control. We have an age ceiling when it comes to having kids that men don't. We're just physically smaller oftentimes, and therefore have to deal with the dynamic, the differences in caring for our safety and so on, right? And so you say that this is sort of admitting this is problematic and scary as a society, because that would mean that the next step normally would be women are somehow inferior in some way. So there's no way of saying not equal, but one is not better than the other in some way, right? And I think that that's a really important point, that this inferiority issue. And then this is the part that I think talks directly to Julie's point around these different mores or norms or something like that, is that coercion, you say, is necessarily part of sex then for women, given this kind of imbalance. And I want to know if we can dig a little deeper, because it's a tough issue you bring. And I love that you bring it up. Go ahead.
So I actually don't think that I say that. I wouldn't say that coercion is necessarily a part of sex for women, that just because women are different from men, they're inherently being coerced by men. I think, so rolling the question back a little bit, I try to, in the book, try and figure out how we got from sort of the aims of the original aims of the sexual revolution and the second wave feminist movements, which were, creating a world where women were valued in and of themselves and women's concerns were valued and validated, where there was an equal concern for women's sexual pleasure and experiences, say, and women were allowed to have the same sexual rights as men, to a place where it has almost become more like women are now expected to be, equality looks like women being more like the median man. So rather than, recognizing women as distinctive, say, but still worthy of respect, it's more that to be worthy of respect, women should erase, in some cases, some of this distinctiveness and act more like men in the sexual realm.
Right.
What I'm saying in that chapter is actually simply that we should be honest about where difference exists and acknowledge that difference does not inherently mean inferiority, that women and men can be different and still be equally valuable and equally of worth. And one of the ways that we would, respect other people in a sexual encounter is to be conscious of who they are as people. If women have different needs or men have different expectations, like actually keeping our eyes open to that and figuring out how we can make an encounter work for both, rather than assuming that one person, usually the man, is the norm, and making women live up to that standard. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally makes sense. And I should definitely, it was an embedded argument that you had, because it was more like when there is coercion, it goes in one direction. And the reason it goes in one direction, right, was that if you pile on these inequalities, it's not about value and who's inferior or not, but that there is more of a chance in these sexual encounters for coercion to go in one direction, i.e. from the man to the woman. And that, I think, is an important thing that is really difficult to tackle, right? Like you were saying, biological differences suggest that when sex is coercive, so that it's the when it is, that coercion tends to run in one direction, male to female. But norms and laws that respect vulnerability, I think this is the really tough and really important point. Norms and laws that respect vulnerability don't erode agency. Rather, they create a framework within which women can develop and act as the fullest versions of themselves, with all of their realities taken into account. It's a better use of our energy to act on the basis of that truth than to maintain that it doesn't or shouldn't exist. I think that's a beautiful balancing act. And I just wanted to throw it out to other people and how that sounds to others.
And I would also say,
sorry, go ahead.
Oh, but also just bouncing back to Julie's point too, about how our norms are not necessarily always in line with our biological desires. So I think that one thing that I also sort of prod at in the book is the question of what should be paramount in all situations. I mean, we have biological desires, we have desires, period. We have urges, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all of them should be acted upon, or that we can justify any action by saying that, well, it's just this is just my desire and I have to fulfill it. I question in some ways the norm that I think actually newer norm, or the newer understanding in a sort of uncritical sex positivity stance, that our bodies make demands of us, or our desires make demands of us, and we are bound and beholden to follow them, as opposed to being able to say, okay, this is a desire, but I can also step back and interrogate, where does this desire come from? Why am I doing the thing that I am doing? What would I do if I felt I had a choice? Do I want to choose to do this thing? Is it good for others? Is it good for society? Is it good for the relationship I'm trying to create? And, take a pause and think about those questions instead of being fully led and driven by desire. Because in some cases, I don't think that desire is paramount. And actually, this is one of the things that we saw in the Me Too moment that I found kind of alarming and confusing. Louis C.K., the American comedian, was sort of Me Too'd because he would expose himself and masturbate in front of his female colleagues. And his excuses first were, well, I asked if I could do it and they didn't say no, so I got consent from them to do it. And then in this question, you have to say, okay, you got consent, but you're a famous comedian and this is your assistant. Like, how was that consent fairly gotten? That doesn't that doesn't really clear things up. And then second, the idea is, well, his defense is like, well, this is what I have to do. This is just like what I need to get off sexually. And so, I asked so I could do it. It's like, okay, maybe that is like what you desire to get off sexually. Does that mean that you have to act on it? Does that mean that you should make other people subject to your desires? Are your desires more important than the experiences of all of these assistants and colleagues you traumatized, even if you got consent from them? And I suggest that in some ways, both the argument of, well, I got consent, and also the argument of like, well, this is just how I feel, like this is what I need, can be used as a cover for selfishness towards other people.
Yeah. Excellent point. I would love to dive deeper into that whole section of the book, the chapter or two around that. So let's definitely put a bookmark on there, because I think you, again, do some pretty brave things at prodding at stuff that we don't talk about. And right or wrong about wherever we land on this, the fact that you're opening it up is just what I'm just like, this is what fucking writers need to be doing. So I just appreciate that. James, please keep us on the other track before we go off again.
Yes, I like to bring into the conversation the very fragmented and contrasting messages that men get growing up. And as an example of that, I remember being very struck by the patriarchy from a very young age, and very anti-patriarchy, and wanting to be safe for women, and being very confused at why the bad boys were getting the women and not me, and not understanding and not having any framework for that, of what to do with this energy in my body, and how when I was repressing that energy in my body, I was no longer a sexual being to that woman. I became a friend, and then finding out in later life that actually a lot of things that I thought was no, don't do that with a woman, a lot of women actually really like and want and desire from a man. And so I think that's really important, that just to know that this messaging is so fragmented, and not even just between porn and media, but from women themselves about what they want. Men aren't getting a very clear and cohesive picture of that. I know there's a lot of differences and for different women, but it is part of the problem, I think.
I would have been horrified if we had finished this session without having that voice and that position being stated. I think it's a really important one. What are other people's thoughts before, or Christine, yourself? I'm sure you're hearing a little, this is I think a pretty coherent and common concern from men as well. At least I hear it often enough.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think having the male perspective is really important. And one of the things that seemed also clear to me in these conversations about a sexual culture that wasn't serving women is that it also wasn't serving men at times. And men also felt, both lost and confused and under pressure to have sex in a certain way or view sex as a certain thing. And so this was damaging to both sexes. I think one of the questions that I asked too in the book is sort of, what do we valorize and why? There is this kind of, a sort of patriarchal view of sex, where men are the pursuers, and like what a man does is get a lot of sex and not care about it, and like have sex with the most people. And that's an assumption that in some ways, it was the feminist movement in the mid-century kind of hoped to overturn, to make sex almost a more equal pursuit, where both sexes could pursue, in fact, love and relationship. And instead, we've sort of moved to a place where it's now, well, just women have to act like men, actually, have to act as kind of men. And we all should pursue as much sex as possible, as uncaringly as possible. And I'm sort of wondering how we got from there to there in that way. And I mean, also, I think that the question of what sex means and what people say that they want from sex is a really interesting one, especially for men, because there were so many men who I talked to who said kind of exactly, James, what you were saying. Well, I kind of got the idea that as a man, I was supposed to want this kind of sex or do this sort of thing to be attractive. But actually, maybe I want a relationship, or maybe I want care or to care about someone. Maybe I want these other things, and yet there doesn't seem to be space for this in our current understanding of what sex should look like. So where do you go from there?
Yeah, and I'm wondering if any of the other men would like to think with us. I mean, I don't necessarily think the best thing is to have a very gendered conversation, but I do think that just as women have their, position and it's good to talk from your own place. I think it's really interesting to get a bit more perspective from the men, if you guys feel comfortable in sharing a little bit about your opinions. Yeah, go ahead. I don't see who's talking. Was it Kevin that were you saying something, or is it just my mic? No worries. So just to prod this a little bit more and see if you guys, so as I said, I have these two 16-year-old boys, and they're very much in this, like, I don't want to do anything wrong, and I want to be a good boy, but I also am 16. That's all I think about. And, the issue around being able to talk about some of this stuff is that also I don't think we have very good language that delineates fantasy and desires. And this is somewhere where you were kind of getting at, Christine, when you talked about desire and then behavior, and that these things can be actually separated and often are. And, one of the things that I think was surprising to many of us is when 50 Shades of Grey went mental in terms of how many copies it sold, and that they sold to women. Never mind the horrific writing, which we will not get into. We shall not.
We already got into this in a Twitter thread. I'm sorry that I tagged you in it, Christine.
I did not see that thread, so I am a independent-minded woman who can actually read, the English language. But anyway, so never mind the poorly written, which I find the most insulting part. But the fact, before that we had Anne Rice, and before that, et cetera, right? But still, the extent of the crazy millions that it sold, I think, surprised many people. And the fact that it was women who were buying it surprised many people. I don't know how you're a man in that culture, in this culture, and do not get a message from that. And rather than having a discussion around that, we went so simplistic and boring and black and white and went, women want to be, tied up and raped, right? And we all have the same fantasy. So I find it very interesting that discussion never became, at least not where I'm around, and even in the media, which I at least have access to, these discussions were not necessarily there was no nuance. And I'm wondering around the men, was there any nuance around these discussions for you guys, right? About these kinds of flips, which Christine gets into in one of her chapters, which is like, is all sex equally good? Should we equally, I can't remember what the topic was. The chapter title was Some Desires Are Worse Than Others, right? And like, kudos, how do you even start with that discussion? But start it, we must. So, thoughts? Julie.
Okay, so I was late to the romance, that type of scene. I really didn't get into it till my mother was dying. I always liked the suspense thrillers as a kid, but I was 33, I think, when I read my first one. And it was really interesting to me because once I got into it, I dove into it. And I looked at all of the different genres, historical, chick lit, erotica, all of it. And I was really surprised at how the narrative shifts. And it really, really, really shifts between 1979 and 1987-ish.
Yeah.
Again, from 87-ish to about 99. And then you run again another gamut. And I literally went all the way back to pilfered my grandmother's bookshelves because I was inheriting her after my mother passed away. And I'm like, okay, why would you like this book? Where did you think that this was okay? And did grandpa ever read these? Like, how does that work? Do you know? Because they honestly, my grandparents were married for 67 years and had a very, I mean, we had to be very careful about knocking on doors and making a lot of noise and saying, guys, we're here, please put clothes on, kind of thing.
Good for them.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I mean, he was 88 when he died, and until he had a stroke 17 months before, we had to be very careful when we walked in the house.
Oh my goodness.
So,
Awesome.
but I was really kind of like, I didn't get into it until, like I said, my mom died and I had my grandmother. She was 94 at the time. And I took all of her books and I was reading them, but you can see a very, very distinct culture shift in the writing by women for women.
What was the shift?
What were the shifts that you saw?
The shift was consent, absolutely consent. There was a lot of, I would say rape, basically. It was forceful, you know, but then it was like, she liked him, he liked her, but we're not going to get together because, you know, I'm promised to somebody else and there's a good guy over here and a bad guy over. I mean, it was just really, it was contentious. The relationships were really toxic, in my opinion. And you really see that dynamic a great deal in the 60s, in the 70s and 80s. And then the books start to shift a little bit in the mid 80s. And the rapey thing is still kind of there until the mid 90s. But then it really starts to, I mean, it almost goes away by 99. So you can, it's just different. Like I said, it's, if you look at, and it goes to the 50 Shades. I mean, the BDSM thing has been around for years, long before What's Her Face wrote, you know, that shitty book, but it wasn't mainstream. And I don't know what brought that particular book mainstream. Like, I don't know what your take on that is. Why, if that has been around and women obviously been reading this stuff for decades, why did it all of a sudden hit mainstream?
You essentially articulated exactly my question.
Right.
It's like these things have been expressed in fantasy. Where did it go from that to surprise chokes kind of thing, right? And I would love to hear, Christine, if you in your research have got a sense of why it did flip into action in this way.
Yeah, well,
without any value. Yeah, sorry.
Yes, right.
I'm not saying it's a good or bad thing. I'm just saying why suddenly does it? Yeah.
Well, James just dropped a note into the chat that I think is really important. So 50 Shades of Grey emerged from Twilight fan fiction. It was actually E.L. James was a fan fiction writer and was writing Twilight fanfic, and it became really popular. And so she like depopulated the IP from it and just turned it into her book series. So yeah. So it actually sort of launched online. It was kind of an online narrative before, and like based in chat rooms. And that is, I think, my theory is that this ties to actually kind of a larger shift in how we come to learn about sex and understand what sex is supposed to look like. You mentioned surprise choking, Isabela. And one of the things that I talk about in the book is how our desires are formed and shaped. We, I think, like to think that all of our desires are innate, that we just want what we want. But, I suggest that we should question, and somebody else mentioned Amia Srinivasan's book here too, and she talks about this too. Why do we want what we want? And where did that come from? And what would we want if we had the choice? And I talked to a lot of young women and men for this book who talked about their desires and their sexual encounters seeming increasingly shaped by pornography, online pornography. There's a woman who I interview who who actually I don't even interview. So one of the crazy things about writing a book about sex is once you tell people you write about sex, people just have stories that they want to get off their chest. They they will tell you things. And this woman at a party tells me, I'm seeing this guy. He's really nice. It's great, except he chokes me during sex, and I don't like that. Is that okay? And she's sort of asking me whether it's okay to not like this thing that she doesn't like, which, first of all, I mean, of course, but the fact that she feels like she has to get permission to sort of not like someone else's desire seems to say something about the current culture. But then also the fact that she acknowledges that this like choking, like, God, you'll have sex with someone and then they'll just choke you. That's like a thing. It happens now. It happens to me. It's like happens to my girlfriend. So maybe this is just what's normal. And I kind of wanted to wonder like where that came from. And talking to a lot of women, they expressed that, especially recently in the modern era, they were encountering in their sort of sexual encounters, guys, especially who they felt like were just sort of playing out moves that they'd seen in porn, or playing roles that they had seen in porn, and assuming that that was what women wanted because that's what they had learned sex looked like. And then I also spoke to a number of guys too, who were like, yeah, well, porn was kind of my first sort of exposure to sex. And that's sort of where I learned what you do. And so that's what I do. And then there were some who were also like, and I have watched porn enough that like now I find it harder to relate to sort of real women because I'm more used to relating to pornography, and that has become a problem for me. And this is all sort of a question of like, where do our desires originate, and like how have certain acts or behaviors or even kinks or fetishes that used to be, I mean, I think there are like a million, there's any fetish under the sun, say, but perhaps the idea of assuming that your sexual partner would like to be choked was not mainstream even 15 years ago, but seems to be mainstream among young people today. Where did that come from, and what does it say about our sort of sexual culture in our society that the desires that we seem to have mainstreamed, or the kinks that we seem to have mainstreamed, are often ones that are in fact still violent towards women or involve some sort of degradation? What is that a good thing? What does that say about our culture at large? And also, can we even ask these questions as opposed to saying like, well, that's just my desire? Like we can't judge anyone's desires.
Yeah, I think those are really important questions. And also that there are other cultures that have dealt with it. So there is, for anybody who's going to be a parent, there's a Swedish book out there, or a series of books. One's called, I think it's called Sex for Guys and Sex for Girls. And I got my closest, like one of my close friends in that same group. Why are all my friends in sex? Anyway, she is Swedish and she wrote the translation. And second chapter after, whether dicks have to be large or small for girls and myths around that. The second one is about pornography, and absolutely talking about like that you can watch it, but it ain't anything like it. And it's the worst manual for learning this stuff. You're going to totally like confuse the girls. And what's great about giving 14-year-olds something like that is that if they're also looking at this stuff, whether you like it or not, they are going to find it somewhere. It's about talking again. It's all about this kind of discussion. And I think what you're doing, Christine, in this book is going like, can we not just, this is bad guy, good guy, like this is evil versus not evil, but start the discussion again. Sorry, didn't mean to go so long. Shahid or Shahid, sorry. I think I said it wrong the first time.
No worries. This isn't exactly a response to the question, just sort of a note I wanted to throw out. I think with regards to the question of sort of how does one, end up sort of wanting what they want, or how does one's the desires or preferences get formed. I mean, I do agree very much with the perspective on porn. And like, I remember being like a teenage boy and frankly, like my guy friends being, oh, that looked fun or cool, and I kind of wish I could, I want to do this, I want to try this someday. But I also think in the absence of like a larger kind of cultural conversation around these topics, like, and outside of sort of like, media, porn being one, or maybe like fiction books or movies or anything else sort of being other, I think a lot of people's sort of ideas around sort of sex also get formed by their personal interactions with their sexual partners. And I think it's like, really like the spectrum of preferences can be so wide, and the number of sexual partners you've had throughout your life, maybe as you kind of approach your mid-20s, that number isn't that large, whereby you end up having a sampling that's not an accurate representation. And that also, I think, kind of skews people's perspectives in a way that hasn't been discussed so far, I don't think. I will say, I mean, just sort of obviously like a small anecdotal piece of data, but when it came to the notion of sort of, for lack of a better term, being more dominating as a man in a sexual interaction, it was actually sort of like the expressed preferences of female partners which nudged me towards that. Never, I mean, in my case, it's never sort of something that, I saw online and I wanted to try. And I think people's preferences tend to range very, very widely. And if you only sort of met a few people, like what you think about how, what people want might not be accurate.
Absolutely. I think it's a great point. And this is partially why I wonder if one of the implications or the the manual that goes with this Rethinking Sex book is beyond the thinking is talking. How do you talk? How do you have conversation starters? How do you have it with potential partners? Like, to me, some of the most surprising parts of your book, Christine, was hearing how many people had this surprise choke. It's like, okay, maybe I wouldn't be surprised about the fact that people have this preference now. It's been out in books and movies, and now you can say, hey, this is something I'm into. Are you into it? How is this a surprise thing, right? That's the part.
You just do it. Yeah.
Yeah, like what? And then okay, sorry. And this is the other very thing that I really would love to get on the table is that I do think that the one thing I would want more to talk about is how women can talk about this and get them to feel like they can talk more openly. And it shouldn't be on them, but unfortunately, even the consent thing was on them for a long time. And so how to empower women to go like, these are my preferences, and this is the sort of thing. Because I think that's where a lot of these problems in terms of misunderstandings might be addressed in the way that you talked about, and even the mystery of it and all of that. Anyway, sorry, Anna.
Elena, or I think Elena had a hand up too,
and
I haven't.
Pardon?
Oh, I think I saw Elena's hand. I don't think we
Elena was first.
her.
Elena.
Oh, okay. Hi.
Just go.
I'll just throw out, I guess, as a woman, every time gender roles are brought up in sex conversations, I feel bad. I gain absolutely nothing from talking about women versus men, and I'll just own that as a woman. Like, I identify with so much stuff about the male perspective, and like, I've pursued people a lot. I've been like weirdly cringily coercive and actually connected with a lot of like male friends because they thought they were so alone and scared about this. I get really frustrated with even referencing gender, rather any abstractions other than the specific person in front of me and like how they're feeling. Like, if we can relate person to person and like there's stuff coming up for us and like one of us is ashamed or like scared or whatever, that's the only thing that really matters to me personally. And around talking about sex. This is kind of weird for me because in my own experience, the bottleneck has been feeling the feelings, like talking, like I freeze in conversation. It's not because I like don't have the right words. It's because I'm like, oh, I just like feel bad now and I have no emotional skill. I just want to like run and hide. But will that be helped by like intellectually talking about sex? Like, no, I had to go through a lot of healing and inner work about that. And like, that's helped me feel a lot more grounded in my relationship to this whole thing. Like, it's actually a little weird for me to go back into this space now because I'm like, oh, I feel so good after just leaving all of the mainstream discourse. And like, I haven't thought about consent in like maybe a year. I've just been like doing my own weird soul journey stuff and it's like felt a lot better. So I'll put that alternate perspective here where like living and growing and building support. And somebody earlier here talked about attachment trauma. That seems like a huge missing piece to me in all this intellectualization where like we're all wounded and like how do we hold each other through that? I actually wonder where he went because I'd be curious to hear from him about all this. But yeah, for me, let's just heal each other. Like that seems like the really obvious thing in the room.
Yeah, I think you make, yeah, no, I think those are really good points. I mean, I think the thing about talking about questions of gender is, for me, one of the things that keeps people from expressing their true feelings about what they desire and what they want from sex and what they experience is sort of gender roles and sort of gender norms that have kind of been placed upon them and that they then feel like they have to live up to. And so one of the questions that I think is helpful to ask, again, is like, where did these norms come from and why do we feel the need to obey them, right? Like, you know, even the question of, you know, who is doing the asking and who is doing the pursuing, or like which role of some gender plays, like why do we even assume that there is one set case? And that's like something worth interrogating. But you also have to kind of like acknowledge that these gender norms exist to be able to deconstruct them first and like understand how they sort of impact people's experience, so that you can kind of move past them, I guess. And yeah, I think, did you mention reading Tomorrow Sex Will Be Good Again, or someone else? Julie. Yeah, I think Catherine Angel makes a really interesting point here that I think resonates with what you were saying, Elena, which is that often our desires are not so clear cut. We feel things, we have emotions, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we know exactly how to express them in each moment, or that they aren't, you know, constantly like flowing and changing in some ways. And so we have to figure out how to account for that in how we relate to each other. And one of the things I think you talk about a bottleneck, and a point that she makes, and that I think is so true, is that it, in some ways, it feels, by suggesting that the only way to, you know, critique a sex act or push back on, you know, something that you don't want to do is by being like, I don't consent because let me lay out all of my extremely valid and clearly thought out reasons for why I don't consent in this moment, is in some ways an undue burden. And it's not how most people exist. It is, in fact, kind of hard sometimes to express those emotions and those feelings coherently. And to suggest that, well, the way to make sex safe for yourself is just to train yourself to say, you have to always be on in the moment and able to say exactly what you want and what you need, and know exactly what you want and what you need in that moment. And that's your responsibility. And no one else is going to do that for you or think for you. So if you don't do it yourself, joke's on you, I guess. Like, whatever happens to you is your fault. That also seems like a very unhealthy expectation that often falls on, you know, especially the people who find it harder to express themselves in that moment, or who are less than sure of themselves in every sexual situation. I guess like the idea that to be able to be safe in a sexual encounter, you have to be perfect at expressing your every emotion clearly. Seems like a really odd standard that we've somehow fallen upon.
Yeah, go for it, Shahid.
I am curious about other people's perspectives around how much of a standard that feels like, meaning, I mean, if I'm understanding you correct, Christine, like needing to have like a sort of well-articulated rationalization or about what you might want or like in that moment or not, because I don't know, a part of consent culture to me seems to be like, oh, maybe I just don't want this right now, and I don't really have like a reason, and that's inherently fine. And I have been in interactions where that has happened, but again, you know, like back to my earlier point, I think my sample size might be small, so I'm just sort of curious around that.
I love the idea, by the way, of a sample size being small, not just experience, but also talking like to those who are open and engaged. And like for me, I had male friends all throughout my adolescence. All my best friends were also men or boys, let's just say. And that's a very different experience and those boys got a lot of information from their closest girl as friends, right? And I think those cross-sex friendships are also maybe undervalued and under thought about, maybe in terms of a resource of feeling empathy and connection before you have sex and start diving into those things. I don't know. Julie, were you next or Anna? I don't know who. I go from left to right, so I keep thinking that all the way to the left is the first one, and so that the last time it was the other way around, so I might be getting it wrong.
So I was just going to quickly talk about Tomorrow's Sex Will Be Good. I thought she didn't do a very good job about what Christine said about, so she talks about basically you need to be able, you know, people talk about how you need to be able to, you know, say what you want, what you desire, that type of thing. If she doesn't really delve into if you've never had sex, you don't really know what you want. And so I don't think she does a very good job of really discussing you know, how do you get to, on your first encounter, know what you want if you're not experimenting and playing and trying. And, you know, why can't you say, that really sucks, you know, stop. We're not doing this anymore. Let's try something else. But we don't even, I mean, I have a 22-year-old daughter and a 19-year-old son. And the first thing I taught them was masturbate. Know what you like to do to yourself, then you can teach somebody else. And you also aren't going to be able to do everything to yourself. So be open to what other people can do for you. And, you know, I mean,
oh my God.
Oh no, I started young. And so I didn't have a problem with these conversations. My kids even come to me and talk to me now. Sometimes I'm like, I don't want to hear this. Yeah. I don't think she did a very good job. But I think, I don't know how you address that. Like, I don't know how, like, at what point, like, I don't know.
Well, I think in Rethinking Sex, again, talking about like what a better standard for good sex would be, I suggest this idea of willing the good of the other, and what it looks like is kind of radical empathy, or an attempt at that, an attempt to, like, the standard for being good at sex or having a good sexual encounter is not necessarily just like waiting for your partner to tell you what you want them to do or tell you no, but also trying to think with them and anticipate their hopes, needs, desires, what they view sex as, so that you can be good to them. So like basically just thinking about the other, which again, it's like, it is harder to do than just like getting somebody to consent to having sex with you and then you have sex with them and get what you want out of it and go. But even just like trying to think with the other person, whether it's aloud conversationally or even just by anticipating, oh, like this person doesn't have the same experience, perhaps I'll go slower because that might be good for them and allow them space to figure that out. Like asking yourself to do that work is a higher standard than just asking yourself to make sure that you're not assaulting. And the show Sex Education, I loved. One critique of the show that I have, though, that somebody else pointed out, I think I was reading a review of it in Slate or The Atlantic, is that it also has this assumption that all of the teens are having sex, and they all are like kind of pretty open about talking, at least to this one guy, about it. Like they're all out there having these experiences, and there's very little mention, except in later in the second season, of people who aren't having sex, who don't want to be having sex all the time, who maybe they're ace, or maybe, they're something else. And like that it's also fine not to always be on and horny. And like, that isn't the definition of being, I don't know, a person. Because I think one of the things that I talk about in the book too, is this assumption that to be like a modern young person, to be not repressed, means that you should be always seeking sex and having great sex. And in some ways, like that then stigmatizes people who aren't doing that. Like there's so many people who feel like, oh, am I weird? Like, am I the crazy one because I don't want to be hooking up with a different person every night? Like, is there something wrong with me? And no, it's not. And where do we get to the place where that feels like it's the case?
Yeah, I think those are really important issues. And also shame. Shame is one thing that I would love to think more about. I wouldn't, but and the shame as the barrier to willing the good in the other. Like, it's really easy to sit down and say to the person, like, I get where you're at, but this is not what I love, or whatever it is. But that we have our own shame and being afraid of shaming the other. And there's so much vulnerability and baggage, and our reactions to shame, which are either anxiety or aggression most of the time, like severe anxiety versus severe depression. So you have somebody either withdrawing or being super aggressive. If you don't have enough of those experiences where it's like kind of the shame is co-regulated between the two of you, I think it's really hard discussion to have. Not that it isn't important. Sorry, Anna, go for it.
I actually wanted to go earlier, but I'm so happy I didn't, because there's a point that came up from multiple different angles. Shahid, you brought it up, Julie, and I think kind of it's been there in multiple different points, which is the responsibility of our first sexual partners. And when I was a teen in the 90s, the whole spiel was about how your first is such a big deal. There was even like a page in the weekly teen newspaper about people talking about their beautiful first sex encounters on the beach with the love of their life, and I don't really see that in conversations anymore. It seems very much about like you exploring yourself, and then you just like finding like a rando to do it with first. But I think, we talk about generational trauma or attachment anxieties. We talk about a lot of different, mimetic desires and repressions. But I find on myself that the main kind of pattern that I bring into my sex life are my first experiences. And I'm not talking about like horrible experiences, but they kind of, I have to unlearn the limitations and the kind of the framework that they created for me. And I don't really see conversation about that. I don't know if this is still a thing, but when we talk about responsibility and decency and dignity and ethics, or why 50 Shades of Grey is so popular, I think 50 Shades of Grey in many ways is about the archetype of the man as the initiator, right? And for many women, the first sexual partner, if they are cis women, is maybe an older guy who's more experienced than you, and you will be initiated. And there's some kind of power dynamic, which in this book is taken to the extreme. And so I wonder what you, Christine, think about the responsibility of the initiator, and whether you noticed any conversation around that in your interviews. And everybody else's opinions, of course.
Yeah, one sort of philosophy on that I really like is Dan Savage's campsite rule. It's like the idea, and this he sort of first started talking about this in the context of older people who would have relationships with younger people, and the idea is that you have to leave them better than you found them. And like this is the sort of responsibility of like an initiator or somebody who has more experience, that it's not just your job to like use the other person, but you actually have to be doing good for them too, in a way, which is sort of another version of willing the good of the other. And I actually talked to Dan Savage about this just recently and the similarities there. And he has continued to sort of refine that view, because I mean, there are also these questions about whether, even if you are trying to leave a person better than you found them, like what does that look like? And like, can you be an initiator without taking advantage of someone? And what does that look like?
Why do you have to leave them?
Yeah, or why do you have to leave them at all? Yeah, but I mean, I think that part of also our responsibility to other people, I think, and our responsibility in defining what good sex looks like, is that it is trying to be encompassing of the other person as a person. So that means trying to kind of figure out and know something about, yeah, maybe it's talking about like what their expectations are, or where these things, their desires come from, like what is their attachment issue, because we all kind of have one, and I think in some cases that means that you end up maybe having sex later, because it actually takes a while to get to know another person, or what the good is for the other person, or how you can be best and most empathetic towards them. But that is also okay.
Yeah.
I recently had a conversation with somebody who was telling me about this couple in San Francisco, and it's a man and a woman, and they didn't have sex for a month, and everybody's talking about this. They fell in love, they dated, and they only had conversations for a month. And this is, I think there's going to be a book and then a Netflix about them.
It's very exciting.
I think that's really true, though, Shahid.
Shahid.
Okay. What you just dropped in the chat, that even if you're trying to be good to someone else, like your intentions may not succeed. Like you may not sort of match up with what is actually good for them. It's hard to know. I think that, I would say that I think that willing the good of the other is a better and higher standard than consent, in part simply because you are just doing that asking. Like, even if you are getting it wrong in some ways, or you don't get the information that you, would have found most helpful, just the fact that you're trying to do that you're actively trying to be better to the other person, is simply better than not doing that at all.
And communicating.
And I mean, like, that's a pretty low bar, but like,
Yeah.
it's still like a higher standard that's still like several steps before where we are right now. And I think it's also important to note too, that like, it's impossible to ensure that nobody gets hurt, right? Or that sex is always good or perfect. And I think one of the things that's kind of interesting here is that in a culture where, we often talk about how sex isn't meaningful, like sex is just like a thing that we do, then people who have sex and then feel hurt, or feel like they have lost something or something has happened, their experience feels kind of invalidated, because they're like, well, if it didn't mean anything, then why do I feel like this about it? And that is sort of a kind of dysphoria that one can experience. And I think it's actually important to acknowledge in many cases, like if you are a person, and most people, it seems like many of the people who I talk to, even as they like sort of purported to be something else, or felt that they should play this like extremely chill, cool role, really thought that sex meant something or significant, then by admitting that and being careful and thoughtful in how you have sexual encounters can help you. It won't save you, from having bad experiences, but being aware that there's something there, something different or meaningful in what you're doing, makes it easier to look for what you want.
Yeah, lovely point. James, you've been waiting a while.
I wanted to just speak to something I think Julie brought up that that is important here of how are we raising our young in this environment, and how are we teaching them about how to go about this. And so when my daughter is 21, but when she was 15, her, just for a backstory, her mom had said she had sex in her senior year in high school, and she said, I would have waited if anybody had talked to me about it. I never had any real instruction or anything. And so I was determined I was going to make sure that my daughter had that. And when she was 15, her mom's rule was as long as the door was cracked, was open, that she could be in her room with her boyfriend. And I walked in on them, and he was sitting on her bed, and there was a cover over, and I saw my daughter's head going up and down. So imagine that for a moment, okay? That you walk in and here it is, and here's this sex positive guy who's had conversations with both of them, and they both said, oh, we're not ready for this. And then I walk into this, and like my girlfriend and I are making dinner for us, and immediately I'm like, and I go in, and it was only cracked this much, and I just open this like, Ella, and I see her head stop halfway right there, like under the cover. Thankfully, I'm so glad there was a cover there. And so I'm like, Ella, she stops and she freezes, and her boyfriend looks away, does not catch my eye. And I said, I'll be back in 1 minute. And I went and I said to my girlfriend, I just caught Ella going down on her boyfriend. And she's like, you did not. I'm like, what do I do? And the first thing she said was, don't shame them. They're not doing anything wrong. And I'm like, they told me like a week ago that they weren't ready. And she's like, they're not doing anything wrong. They're just, and she's like, don't shame them. So I went back in and I opened the door, and my daughter was like, no, Dad, no, I don't want to talk about it. I was like, oh yeah, we're talking. And she did not want to have that conversation then. And so what I said to her was, now it's time to get you a coach. And I hired a coach, and I paid $1,500 because what I said to her was, hon, you have body shame. You don't even feel comfortable in your body. Like, that needs to be addressed before you move forward down this path. And so I hired her coach, and on her first session, her coach was basically talked to her mom and I about how sexual energy is powerful. And it's like 1 minute you're in a kayak or in a canoe on the pond, and then all of a sudden you're in the rapids, and then you're upside down and the canoe's gone, and like that's how fast it goes. And she shared a story of how when she was 15 and had sex, and afterwards she was like, I didn't know I could say I don't feel comfortable, and if I had known that I could say that, it wouldn't have happened. It would have. And so on her she was very conscious about this at first, but on her 5th session that she had with her, she came out totally empowered and said, Dad, Sherry says that she thinks I should own my orgasm before I give it to a boy. So can you buy me a vibrator? And I'm like, I think your mom should do that, so there's no crossed wires. And I was like, yes, that's my daughter. And what I told her was I wanted her to own her no, and I wanted to own her yes. I want, like, sex is fantastic. I want you to own your yes. And until you have a strong no, you can't fully own your yes. And I feel like I rocked that moment as a dad. I'm like, and it worked. She's very empowered around her sexuality because I got somebody who she didn't feel that she felt comfortable with to teach her about her body and to give her this. And I think that we can do better. We can do a whole lot better with our kids than what we've been doing. And like, that was the best $1,500 I ever spent, was to give her the confidence to have her voice, to have her power, and it was just very powerful for her. So I just wanted to presence that.
Thanks, James. What a story, man. I was traumatized by having to buy the razor thing. I don't know what you call the manscaping thing. I was like, okay, here, have my Amazon card and don't talk to me about it. No, I'm not that bad, but it was a thing. Shahid, I don't know how you're going to follow that story, but good luck. Was it your hand up?
No.
Oh,
I will make a quick point now that I have the floor. I mean, I kind of deeply appreciate and respect what you did, James. And as someone who kind of grew up in a culture or family where talk around sex was sort of taboo and, you know, something you kind of hid from your parents and no one really talked about it. I do think that kind of like programs or sort of like hardwires you in certain ways. And I think this sort of being able to be open about it as a parent, as a caregiver, seems to be a much healthier way to, you know, raise kids. As someone who's only been a child and not a parent, so take that for what you will.
Yeah, I think one of the things that so many of the people I interviewed for the book also talked about was this idea that they wish that they had sex ed that was not just about the mechanics, but actually about like, what do relationships look like? Like, how do you relate to another person? Because, and I talk about my own sex ed here too, because I grew up in Richmond, Virginia. So it was like abstinence only basically. And we like watched a video about like the female reproductive system and the male reproductive system. And then like a terrifying video about STDs. And so it's like, you like learn the mechanics. It's like, but you never learn really what you're supposed to do. You know, it's teaching someone to drive by explaining how a braking system works, but never actually explaining like, oh, those like red octagon signs, they mean something too, actually. And like, oh, this is actually what a car is holistically, not just sort of like the mechanical underpinnings. And just so many people said that their sex education would have been better and they wish that they had learned to talk about the relationship aspect and the other sort of the other person aspect, not just which part goes where.
Yeah. So I think exactly that there's an important point where your book starts one part of the conversation. Parenting is one part. I also do, despite definitely having quite open conversations with my boys, also feel like there is a space where they should, and it would be wonderful if they had a peer group that they can talk openly about these kinds of things and share anxieties, but also share like things that they've learned from one another. And although I think parents definitely can do a lot, like I actually let the door close because whatever they're going to do down the street in a car, they'll do across the hallway. But I know we all have very different ways of thinking about that. But talking explicitly about what that means and why and trust and all of that is really important. And other elements in the school context and in the II, even like Anna has very generously encouraged a session that we're first trying. This is not a pitch because you guys are too old for this, but I think it's really interesting where communities can do something as well. It used to be that communities would be the context in which there were either rites of passage or there were people talking to you that were not your direct parents that you had to kind of feel that, awkwardness around as well, and other men or other women that would help you through transitions. And so with the II, we have the first one tomorrow starting, where it is talking about life, and the host, I'm co-hosting it, but the host is a man, barely, he's 23, but he's got his shit together, right? And he's like a constant, really caring, really empathetic guy. And he's just like, there's too many fucking depressed kids out there. Can we just do something about this? Can we start talking about what life hard questions are? And they are about relationships. And they're exactly to your point, Christine, about how do you like even start a conversation with somebody you have a crush on? Or how do you like think about what's appropriate in the second date? Or how do you think about anyway? And so it's a series, a salon series only for 14 to 19-year-olds. And hopefully this will give them an opportunity to ask like big questions in a non-shamed way and have an opportunity to share with each other, most importantly, that the normativeness of struggling through all of these really big questions. So yeah, I'm very excited about it. So I know we're over time and I want to be very respectful of your time, Christine. Thank you. 1,000 thank yous for coming here, for writing the book. And it's going to be a definite recommendation thing that I do for friends and others in my professional context. So thank you for writing it and sharing with us today, this afternoon, evening, what it is. for everyone here. And I know everybody else seems to have appreciated your time. And
Yeah, thank you
all. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much for having me. I was just seeing the necessary but not sufficient dialogue in the chat, and it's like exactly right. But this was a great conversation. I'm glad I was able to do it with you guys.
Absolutely. And yeah, and thank you all for coming and showing up, because this would not be anything without your participation and your care and your openness. I'm really, really thrilled that we were able to have this discussion, and hope to see you all in other salons around the world, basically. And Christine, I hope to see you a little more too. And if you ever drop by other II events. Anna, thank you for just making this shit happen.
So much, Christine. I mean, this has been fantastic, and I'm so glad the New Brass you could drop by. I know you're traveling today, so it's extra. It's Christine. The kind of background is like so many Interact hosts are here, and it kind of makes it a very special event for me as well. Thank you so much, and congratulations on all your very well-deserved success. And I will be reading your next essays and articles with interest.
Thanks.
Keep in touch with us. Thank you so much, guys. Take care.
I will do. Bye.
Bye all.
Good
Thank
night.
you again.